Good morning. It's great to be here. A special shout out to everyone joining us online, and a special shout out this morning to Takatnu. I am so glad that we have a campus, Change Point Campus, a church in Northeast Campus in my neck of the woods. So good morning, Takatnu. Thanks for joining us, and welcome. This has been a remarkable series. There are conversations that I've had around my kitchen table that have changed because of the skills that I have been challenged to put into practice during this series, and today is no different. I would maintain that the skill that we're going to learn today is one of the most counterintuitive, most difficult to actually put into practice, and I'm eager to be the one to put that challenge out to our church family today. I live in Northeast Anchorage, have for almost 20 years now, but as some of you know, I was born and raised in New York in the 80s and in the 90s. And one of the very special parts of growing up in New York in the 80s and the 90s was the access that we had to the arts, okay? Museums, music, galleries, and we had access to all kinds of arts and cutting edge things that were happening in the arts community. And one of the things we had access to under that umbrella is Broadway. 80s and the 90s were the days before the internet. So getting tickets to a Broadway show was an adventure in phone calls, long lines, and insider tips. And if you had tickets to a show, you would almost present that information to people. You'd be like, "Hi, how are you?" "I'm good." "Well, is there something you need to tell me?" It's like, "I got tickets to a show." And this kind of awe would come out. I mean, it was special. It was a big deal. And in December 1996, I got tickets to a very special Broadway performance. It was a new show. It was the original cast, and there was unbelievable hype around this show. And the tickets were hard to get, and I got tickets. What was interesting is that it was a musical about people dying of terminal illness. It was serious. The story of the musical asked these questions. What does it mean to die with dignity? How do you measure the influence of somebody's life? How do you quantify that? And what role do family and friends play as they walk with terminally ill loved ones to their pending death? Now, some of you hear that and you're thinking, really? Of all the shows you could see, that's the one you wanted to go for? Well, I couldn't wait to go. Sounds strange, but here's my story in this. I wanted to go because my mom was in the middle of dying. And I was asking the same questions that this show seemed to promise to ask and to answer. And so I remember arriving at the Nederlander Theater, West 41st Street. It was a small venue, which kind of made it extra cool. And I was ready. And I came ready. And what I mean by that is I was ready to listen, not just with my ears, but with my eyes and with my heart and with my head. And I was ready, literally, I think, to leave my world for a little while and to enter into this world of this story. And I was hopeful that something that I was going to experience that day in this world of this musical was going to do something in my heart. I think I was hopeful for things I couldn't even measure or explain, entering into the mystery of this other world to answer these questions that were kind of rumbling inside of my heart. So the lights go down, and from the very first moment, from the first guitar chord, the first voice singing, something really weird was going on around me. People in front of me, people behind me, people around me, they all started singing along loudly. And I was like mad. Shh. Everybody singing. They felt like they were kind of ruining it. I was distracted. Talk about an iceberg moment, right? I remember thinking to myself, this isn't right. The only required activity at that moment, in that space, in that moment of time was to listen, wholeheartedly. The only thing that should be happening were these professionals taking us into the world of this story, not a sing-along. Now, I've had some years to think about this, kind of process through what happened. And I think when it comes down to it, quite simply, all I really wanted to do in that moment was to listen. I wanted 150 minutes where I could enter into the world of the story that these amazingly talented performers had worked so hard to prepare, right? I valued their work and their sacrifice and the talent, all of the emotional and the physical and the intentional work that they had put into this performance. I valued the Broadway experience. And when these audience members around me were so quick to participate like that, I remember thinking, this is not how it's supposed to be. I mean, maybe if we were at like a Sesame Street show or like The Wiggles, where you're in a costume and it's like a family sing-along, maybe. But a Broadway show, especially this one, all we really needed to do was to listen. The story came to mind pretty powerfully this week. So powerfully, I was kind of surprised by it. And I think that this story of going to this show and having that experience came to mind this week as I prepared for this message for two reasons. The first reason is this. Today we're going to talk about leaving our world and entering into somebody else's world. Just like what happens at a Broadway show, right? You kind of leave your story, you leave your life for a little while, and you kind of enter in fully, wholeheartedly, mind, with your eyes and your heart into this story. In some ways, every interaction that we have with somebody else is an opportunity for us to leave our story for a little while and to enter into somebody else's. Except the difference is between a Broadway show and a person is that a person is a person. Their story is real. And that when we enter into somebody's story, when we leave our world for a little while and enter into somebody else's story, there's a transaction that happens there relationally that is deep and significant. I think this idea of leaving our world and entering into somebody else's, I believe it's actually a biblical concept. And I believe that it's a biblical concept because that's what Jesus did. Jesus left his world, Jesus left heaven and entered into our world here on earth. God became a man. And it was one of the most sacrificial, powerful acts of love that I would say has ever been done ever. So, again, I think the Broadway story came to mind because of this idea of leaving our world and entering into somebody else's world. And again, what a difference. I mean, Broadway is a show, but people are people, right? Okay, second reason I think this story came to mind is because today we're also going to talk about the power of listening. And I hope that I'm going to make a case that listening in and of itself, just listening, just wholeheartedly listening, in and of itself is a very special and sacred and important activity, which everybody should have been doing at the Nederlander Theater back in December of 1996. I also believe that listening is a major biblical concept. There are many verses that talk about listening and the power of listening. And what I want to do today is I want to bring these concepts together, the concept of leaving our world and entering into somebody else's through the action, the vehicle of listening. One of the ways that we can model the way of Jesus is by leaving our world and entering into the world of somebody else. And the way that we can do that is through listening. So do you see how the two things kind of come together? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about leaving our world and entering in somebody else's, and how the power of listening is connected to that. And here's the big idea. Incarnational listening is a Christ-like act of love. I want to say that one more time, because there's like a lot of words and ideas coming together there. Incarnational listening is a Christ-like act of love. The first thing we need to do is we need to talk about this idea of incarnational, right? Jesus loved us. Kind of first point today. Jesus loved us by leaving his world and entering our world. That's what we mean when we say incarnational. Okay, it's a fancy word. It's a Jesus-y word. It's a churchy kind of word. But that's what we mean when we say incarnational. Jesus leaving heaven and entering our world, God becoming man and coming to earth. That's called the incarnation. And there are some verses that help us to understand this, and I'm glad, because the whole idea of incarnation is kind of mind-bending. It's different. It's hard to understand. It's complex. And the verses, I think, that really help us to understand, well, what do we mean by incarnation? Leaving worlds? Well, let's take a look. In John 1, verses 1 through 3 and verse 14, I think this is the one that I think is kind of the most clear to help us to get there on this concept. It says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." There's another verse that helps us with this. It's in Philippians chapter 2. "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So when we talk about incarnation, or something that's incarnational, basically we're talking about the amazing reality that Jesus was fully man and was also fully God. That God became a man without ever stopping being God. And God coming to us on earth incarnationally, right? Leaving this world and coming into this one through Jesus was a profound act of sacrificial love. And I think the incarnation of God was a profound act of love, because the incarnation for Jesus must have meant loss and sacrifice in some way, right? He left heaven and came to earth. He lost heaven for a little while and entered into a world. I mean, think of the contrast. We live in a world of what? Sorrow and pain and chaos and confusion. And Jesus lived a life that was, for the most part, misunderstood and unappreciated. And there's a lot of felt experience that must have come with that contrast of leaving this world. And so what a profound act of love to sacrificially leave this place to come to this place. But what's also true, and kind of amplifies the fact that this was a significant act of love, was that the incarnation of Jesus meant loss or sacrifice or pain or whatever we want to call it for a greater purpose. No greater love is there than this, that someone should what? Lay down their life for a friend. That there's a greater purpose in this. And we know when we think of the life of Jesus, we know there was a We know there was a greater purpose, especially for us who are followers of Jesus, been born again. We're like, talk about a greater purpose. The greater purpose was me. The greater purpose was you. The ministry of Jesus on earth revealed and taught people about the kingdom of God and God's plan of redemption. The ministry of Jesus pointed people to the goodness of God. The ministry of Jesus showed us these human interactions and kind of showed us what does it look like to be, to love God and want what he wants in the context of like interactions with people. The incarnation of Jesus resulted in a final sacrifice sufficient to cover the sin of the world and to restore us to relationship with God. So loss, struggle, but all for a greater purpose. What's also interesting about the incarnation is that Jesus was able to mysteriously hang between these two worlds. And what I mean by hanging between these two worlds is he never lost the fact that he was God, and at the same time he was able to kind of enter into people's stories. That must have been wild, right? God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and has all authority, and that never changes. So that's true, but what's also true is that Jesus engaged with people exploring their lives on these one-on-one interactions that were very relational. It's like Jesus listened, but did he have to? Jesus was able to hang between the two worlds of heaven and earth. And what was the result of that? Talk about a greater purpose or a greater thing. And whatever that sacrifice was for him, the people that he interacted with, they felt known and they felt cared for. They knew the love of God. They could understand truth about God because of the interactions that they had with Jesus. And they were invited to have this life-changing, life-altering, ongoing relationship with God through their interactions. Jesus leaves heaven, comes to earth, fully God, fully human, hanging between these two worlds. It's mysterious. It's wild to even consider. The incarnation of God. And the Bible is full of these examples of Jesus hanging between these two worlds and entering into people's lives, entering in through the way that he would interact. I think of Simon Peter, right? Jesus entered into the world of Simon Peter's ambition and his leadership. And Jesus modeled for him what encouragement and what challenge looked like for discipleship. It's in Matthew 16. Jesus entered the world of Nicodemus and Nicodemus' religious pride and prestige to teach him that knowledge is not salvation. That salvation comes from a born-again faith. Jesus entered cross-culturally into the world of the Samaritan woman, showing her that God's love and salvation extends to everyone cross-culturally, regardless of their sin story, right? Jesus literally entered into the home of Zacchaeus, much to the disdain of everybody who observed it, demonstrating how the kindness and the presence and the power of God can completely transform someone regardless of the lifestyle that they've anchored their lives in. And we all remember how Jesus entered the world of grief experienced by Mary and Martha. Isn't it interesting how Jesus did that first before the resurrection of Lazarus, right? He entered into their world of grief. Jesus loved us by leaving his world and entering ours. Jesus loved all kinds of people by leaving his world and entering into theirs. And the love was for these very individuals that I've named, and it's for us in reading those testimonies and those stories throughout the Bible, but it's also for us in the legacy that we get to be a part of kind of after the cross and the risen Jesus. So one of the ways of God is the way of incarnation. Jesus loving us by leaving his world and entering into ours. So I want to bring this together now because we have this idea of incarnation, but then we also have the act of listening. Second point for today is this: we love others by listening incarnationally. That's the tool, that's the skill, that's what we're going to kind of chew on today. And I think it's important because I'll tell you what, we're not good listeners. I don't even know you, and I'm telling you you're not a good listener. It's not a natural thing for us to do, to embrace listening in and of itself as a sufficient thing that we just do, and it's complete in and of itself. And we know that listening matters because the Bible tells us that it matters. These verses are tough, too. I only picked 3 of them. James 1, verse 19. Know this. Know this. Know this. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Proverbs 18, verse 2. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Proverbs 18, verse 13. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Listening is one of the primary ways that we can engage incarnationally with others. It's the way that we can leave our world and all that's good and comfortable and sweet about that and just enter somebody else's world and kind of hang, kind of like Jesus, hang in the tension of that. I want to talk about that for a little bit. One of the big differences between us and Jesus is that we're not all-knowing, right? We need to listen. We need to ask questions in order to enter into somebody's world. It's like, did Jesus need? He already knew, so did he need to ask? He did it. He did it anyway. The way that we gain the knowledge, like the real knowledge, the true knowledge, the clear knowledge, to walk through life with other people in a deep and meaningful relationship is through listening. Tara and I were talking about this last night. She goes, isn't it interesting? Jesus listened for 30 years before he was put into this public position and kind of stepping into his ministry. And like Jesus, there's going to be some loss and some sacrifice for us if we step into listening to people. What do we lose? What do we sacrifice? I think that incarnational listening means that we sacrificially lay down our comfort, we lay down our schedule, we lay down our opinions, we lay down our advice, we lay down our perspectives, and we lay down what's normal to us so that we can engage sincerely with somebody with a curious heart. I love that phrase, with a curious heart, an interested mind, and this, I really want to know you intentionality as we engage with people. It's like listening to love. And we hang between 2 worlds. We hang between 2 worlds. It's mysterious. And what I mean by hanging between 2 worlds is we're kind of between our normal and the story that we're hearing. And I think effectively hanging between 2 worlds means you can listen and not take what you're hearing personally and not get offended. You can listen to somebody and know your identity as a follower of Jesus isn't going to change. I can listen to you and I'm going to stay saved. I can even keep my opinions and my thoughts and my resolve. I keep my talents. I keep my perspective. I keep my point of view. And it just kind of gets suspended for a minute as I just do the listening. Sometimes when I listen to people, I don't like what they say at all. And I don't agree with them. And it's okay. It's okay. Could you imagine listening to people and to really be okay with whatever's being said? Hanging between two worlds means that you hold on to the fruit of the Spirit no matter what you're hearing. So you're listening, and you're still able to extend love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. So entering into somebody's world and listening wholeheartedly, it's kind of sacrificial. There's a little bit of loss. There's a little bit of pain maybe. From my perspective and my experience, here are some things to listen for to let you know that you're listening incarnationally. You're listening in such a way that you can enter into somebody's world. Here are some things to listen for. If somebody says to you, as they're sharing or after they've shared with you, if they say, "I've never told anybody this before." Listen to me. If somebody ever says that to you, you need to know that you're standing on sacred ground. When somebody says to you that they've never told anybody before, it's because they haven't. And for some reason, in that moment, there was a safety and a trust. I mean, think of God's timeline in people's lives. Like, when does the confession come? When does the healing come? When does the forgiveness come? When does the salvation come? God has this timeline, and there are these moments when we enter in with people hanging between our world and their world, and something gets said. And you being there as the listener is significant. Here's another thing to listen for to let you know that incarnational listening is happening. It's when somebody says, "Thank you. Thank you." And you're thinking, "I didn't do anything." It's kind of weird, isn't it? I think when you're listening incarnational, it really doesn't feel like you're doing anything because you're not doing anything. You're just listening, right? It's kind of an abstract concept I feel like we're kind of grabbing onto today. But I'm hoping that somewhere in your heart, the way of this is kind of, there's something inside that's saying yes to the way of Jesus, the fact that Jesus loved us by leaving his world and entering into ours, retaining himself fully, sacrificed for this greater good, and that we get to do that kind of a thing when we listen to people. All right, let's talk a little more practically about like what this looks like. And it leads me to my third point. Incarnational listeners, they sacrifice for a greater reward. And I just want to say, incarnational listening, it's hard work. And it doesn't come naturally. You are going to have to resist and to fight back so many things as you step into this skill. Before I read those to you, I just want to read a short section from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Starting in verse 4, it says, "Love is patient and kind. It doesn't envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It doesn't insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with truth. Love bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. And the reason why I love this verse and talking about this in the context of incarnational listening is that's a kind of a verse that describes a sacrificial way, right? Not insisting, not irritable, not resentful, doesn't rejoice at wrong, rejoices with truth, bears all things, believes, hopeful, right? There's this lowly way of love in 1 Corinthians 13 that I feel like should be this banner we kind of fly over our interactions. So if part of incarnational listening is sacrifice, what do you sacrifice? What do you sacrifice when you step into this kind of an interaction with somebody? Well, you sacrifice the tendency, the easy tendency to just add other things onto your listening. An incarnational listener, again, sees listening in and of itself as a singular, sacred, important activity. You don't add on judgment. You don't add on interpretation. You don't add on building an agenda and fixing somebody. You just kind of leave those out. Never underestimate the power of giving someone a safe place to find the words to share their story. That in and of itself is a singular, sacred, important, worthy activity. I think that an incarnational listener sacrifices their agenda for a little while. We wrestled with this agenda in the teaching team. It was a good conversation because I came in, I was like, incarnational listening is listening without agenda. And everybody's like, yeah. And I was like, wait, we're Christians. We always have an agenda. I mean, we do, don't we? I mean it. Like, there is an agenda. When I interact with somebody, I think the agenda is always love. And the agenda really, in many ways, is what is God's agenda in and through me as a Spirit-empowered believer, as an ambassador of Christ, making disciples who make disciples, right? Like, there is an agenda, but we sacrifice the agenda for a little while so that we can listen and get the fullness of somebody and just be with them while they share. And then I started to think about the agendas that we have as followers of Christ. And I mean like the good agenda, like people getting saved. It's good, right? Giving good counsel and good advice. That's good. Confessing something. Somebody confesses something, or we confess to somebody else. That's good. And then there's healing that comes, or somebody grows in their sanctification. That doesn't happen if we're just robots and there's no talking going on. Listening is a part of all of those things I just listed, right? I mean, you can't share the gospel without some listening happening. Listening for context, right? And then sharing and somebody listening. Listen, faith comes by, like hearing, like. But I think what we're talking about today is the first thing, the first act, and seeing the first act of just entering into somebody's world through listening as a good thing, as a sufficient thing, as a first thing. And that's why I say an incarnational listener sacrifices their agenda for a little while. And I'd like to think that there's more wisdom and discernment and skill and context and art that comes out of the listening first. An incarnational listener sacrifices time and energy. It takes time to listen to everything, doesn't it? I mean, it takes a little time to listen to some things, but to listen to everything takes some time. And an incarnational listener, it takes time to listen not just to somebody's words, but to listen to their expressions and to listen to their tone of voice, to listen to their tears, to listen to their intensity. I mean, come on, have you ever been with somebody who's crying? It's not like they're talking a lot while they're crying. And if you're there either saying or with the mind, like, come on, right? It's not incarnational listening. You sacrifice the time it takes to listen to somebody. And I think sometimes incarnational listening means that you're asking some questions. Brandon talked about this. Lightly asking questions without hijacking the conversation. Asking about feelings and thoughts and values and beliefs. But the questions should bring more words from them, not more words from you. That's the difference. Incarnational listeners sacrifice through a sincere and careful response. So why would we say that a response is sacrificial? Well, because that also takes time. To be careful and sincere will take some sacrifice, because being careful and sincere is not quick. Asking questions to make sure you're hearing right, with a countenance of gentleness and gracefulness. There's a sacrifice in that because it's not simple and it's not quick. Okay, last thing. An incarnational listener sacrifices their need to control the outcomes. And I love this, because just because you heard something doesn't mean you become God in this person's life. It may mean that you take a part. It may mean that you're part of some kind of a response. It may mean nothing, really. Maybe you go to pray for them. I don't know. But an incarnational listener sacrifices their need to listen and then go to feel like they've got a control or something. In our biblical counseling here in the church, we hold on to this value. Basically, an incarnational listener entrusts growth to God, which means that God can, will, and is able to bring the right amount of healing and help to somebody at the right time, at the right pace, whether it's big or small, fast or slow. Again, in God's timeline of working in somebody's life, does he know what he's doing? Yes or no? Yes. So again, this third point, incarnational listeners sacrifice. Well, we've talked about the sacrifice, but for what? We sacrifice for this greater reward. And what is the greater reward? What's the result if we could step into this as a church, as people, as Christians? I mean, how cool would it be if we had the reputation of like, oh, I've got something heavy. It's like, go find a Christian, talk to them. They're good at this stuff. Wouldn't it be great if we had that reputation of just being listeners that demonstrate the heart of Christ in the way we do it? So cool. But what's the greater reward? I think the greater reward, I'm going to give you an answer to that in three ways. What's the greater reward? The first way, I'll say this. Listening to people, the greater reward is listening to people in such a way that somebody knows that they're seen and heard and known, and believing in ourselves as the listener, that our listening at any given moment can be used by God to do amazing things. That listening is a gateway to healing and help and hope and perspective and knowledge and understanding and freedom and salvation and relationship and depth and peace and joy. That listening is like the key or the gateway or the door opening to the whole storehouse of God. That's the greater reward. Seeing the value of listening as this like step to something else that God is going to do. What's the greater reward of the sacrifices and the work and the disorienting experience of listening to somebody incarnationally? Well, the second way I want to answer that is through a quote. This is from David Augsburger. David Augsburger is kind of famous as a pastoral counselor and theologian. He says it this way. He says, being heard, listen to this, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. Almost indistinguishable. Being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, they're almost indistinguishable. That's powerful. That's powerful, that listening is that kind of act of love. And the third way I want to answer, and we'll kind of close with this. The greater reward as we step into this kind of listening. John 13, verse 34, it says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The greater reward is somehow tied to people knowing and experiencing the love of God in the way that we listen. That's cool to me. Okay, so big idea for today. Incarnational listening is a Christ-like act of love. And the pastor's challenge for you this week is this: practice. There's so many opportunities you'll have an opportunity to practice incarnational listening the moment you turn to the person next to you. I mean, there's times and context for this, so it kind of works a little better, right? But we've given you a tool this week to help you to have a conversation. And what I love about the tool is it's kind of a to-do list and a not to-do list. And I would encourage you to have that tool out as you're engaging in an important conversation. Now that's weird, but it's only weird for a little while. Every skill is weird when you try it out for the first couple of times. In our tool this week, we're challenging you to have conversations where you're listening incarnationally and then to talk about how you're talking about what you're talking about. It's a fancy way of saying you're just going to debrief the conversation. You're going to talk about the listening and what went well. Talk about how you talk about what you're talking about. The other thing I like about the tool to practice this week is the tool is going to challenge you in your listening and in your interacting to see the difference between when somebody is communicating a feeling and when somebody's communicating a thought. Because a lot of times when people talk, they mix them both. It's like if I said, "I think I really like the introduction music to the sermon series." Well, do I think that, or is that a thought or a feeling? What am I trying to say? Right? A thought, a feeling, what's the difference? How do we listen to that? And how do we ask questions that can help people have the experience of being fully known in all of the things that they're saying when they share their story? Which is thoughts and feelings and wonders and hopes and dreams, all the things, right? But again, that's part of the skill, being able to see the difference between when somebody's communicating a thought, when somebody's communicating a feeling, and what's the difference? How do you even go there? Okay. Second part of the pastor's challenge this week, pray while you listen. I think this is one of those skills that prayer, I mean, if we all have the bad habit of not listening well, I'm just going to say, I think we do. How do you break a habit that's embedded? If you've ever had a habit that's been broken, you know prayer is required. Breakthrough is possible, but it's a prayer thing. So pray that your habits would be changed, that your style might be changed, that your confidence would grow, that you would trust that listening in and of itself is the big thing that we're making it to be today. And then my last challenge to you is this: expect God's greater reward. One of the ways of Jesus is that greater things flow from simple things. It's so cool. The kingdom of God is so cool. Greater things flow from simple things. Simple things like kindness. Simple things like prayer. Simple things like listening. That greater things flow from simple things. That's expecting God's greater reward. Stepping into something and expecting. Not just wondering, not just asking, but expecting that through this simple sacrifice, this simple activity, this simple thing, that God is going to do great things. Okay. Incarnational listening. What a phrase. Incarnational listening, a Christ-like act of love. Pray with me. God, thank you for the ministry of Jesus, which models so many things for us. There's so much for us to see and know and understand through the things that Jesus did, but not only through the things that he did, but in the way that he did them. And I pray that this would be a season where we find ourselves in the relationships that matter the most to us, able to hang between our world and the world of the person that we're listening to, and to trust that as we just kind of step into somebody's world and all that they're experiencing, that there's a great act of love that's happening. Even though it's simple, it's hard, difficult in many ways, it's simple in many ways. Oh Lord, I think of what it would be like to have a reputation as a church family, or even as Christians in general, that when people experience trouble or they experience loneliness or they have deep wonders about things, that their instincts would be, go and talk to a Christian, because when they listen, it's an experience in and of itself. Help us to know when to just listen and to be at peace. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.